Welcome back to yet another day of Think Career Conclave 2021. Who is a new millennial? Let us hear it from Rajiv Malhotra. An activist and author, he is the founder of Infinity Foundation, which focuses on Indic studies. He is in conversation with author and senior journalist Kaveri Bamzai.
It's quite a privilege to talk to him. I've just read his new book, which I recommend highly to everyone. It's AI and the Future of Power. Mr. Malhotra, my first question to you really is that you really are a product of the very things you criticize. You talk about the Western universalism, which is sort of inherent in AI, and we think that AI is, value neutral, and it's not. But you are a very product of that. You went to St. Stephen's College, Syracuse University. You spent so much time as an IT entrepreneur. What made you undertake this journey, which is actually quite the reverse of your upbringing, so to speak?
So first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to this. So to get to my background, the thing is, I am a product of Western education. My father was from a very Westernized family, and I was sent to very Westernized education all the way through St. Stephen's College, where I studied physics honors. And then I came to the United States to do a PhD in physics and switched to computer science, where my specialty was AI. And I did have a very successful career, both in the large corporate world at the top, then as a management consultant to get AT&T and British Telecom and others into new ventures, the new IT age. And then I started my own companies in 20 countries, did very well. And then I quit all of that. And I took a pledge that I'm not going to be in the for-profit sector. I'm going to give back to society. And so I took a chunk of the money I'd made and put that into my foundation. And ever since, I've honored my pledge. 94, I started the Infinity Foundation. The tendency towards this was there before, but I was still in the business. And then certain things happened. I said, okay, the time has come. I should just get out. Had I stayed, I mean, the things could have gone 10x, 100x, because that IT sector, things just exploded after 94. I could say, oh, maybe I should have continued and all that. But I don't regret it, because what I gained as a human being, what I gained in my own journey, in my own inward journey, my own meditation, my own tapasya, my own understanding of heritage and culture is invaluable. It's priceless. So the reason I did this is because I had some extraordinary spiritual awakening, some experiences that were happening over a period of time. And then they happened to such an extent that it became very clear to me that, rather than pursuing more of the same, which means I'll just get more zeros at the end of my net worth, and it's not going to change my life, I should do something qualitatively, dramatically different while I'm still young enough, have enough energy, and have enough brain power to think and to pursue. So I made this change dramatically and never looked back. Now, what I brought with me to this new career, let's say for the last 26, 27 years, career in humanities, social sciences, understanding faith and understanding world culture, all kinds of issues that are not typically taught to the techies of the world. What I brought to it is analytical thinking, logic, hard work, because, meritocracy, ability to articulate, ability to face opponents and debate, because you got to do that in your corporate life and as an entrepreneur, the ability to take risks. And I was always a risk taker. So I brought these, and I was I was totally an outsider in this new space. And people made fun of me. They said, who the heck is he? He's not qualified. He doesn't have this or that diploma. And why is he talking about things he doesn't know anything about? But, being self-taught has its advantages. You don't have anything to lose. You can take risks. You can take on the establishment, which I did, because I'm not part of the product of the establishment. They're not going to hire me for anything. They're not going to fire me from anything. I'm not looking for becoming a elected official in politics. So I have no concern about whether I'm politically powerful, popular or not. I'm not looking for any awards. I'm not looking for any positions. And so, in a sense, I have nothing to lose. I can be a radical. And this is what I enjoy doing. And so I have moved quite rapidly in the last 27, 28 years in this career, if you will, from the kinds of issues, and I've gone into the left wing, the right wing, the middle ring. I've gone into critique of the West. I've gone into critique of India. And I like to think of myself as a free-spirited thinker, and therefore here I am.
Wonderful. But, I just want to take you back to 1994. It must have been quite a lonely beginning, because it's very fashionable, of course, to do some of the things that you're doing now. But at that point, a lot of people must have thought that you're just crazy.
So, the thing is this, even now it's not fashionable because either the people who are successful will continue on their business career and
Right.
write checks on the side,
Right.
okay, and make speeches, but they have not given up.
Right.
In
Right.
my case, I gave up in order to get into something else. So it's like burning your bridges and saying, okay, there is no such thing as going back. I just burnt my bridges.
Right.
That requires a level of audacity that I don't think the philanthropist today has. The philanthropist today is giving his money, being very risk averse in what he will fund. If you look at CSR,
Yeah.
the CSR people in India are not going to support me at all. They never have, because it's too risky. They don't know which government will be liking me or not liking me, and whether I may say something that may be too audacious. So they're not risk takers. So in that sense, there's a difference between my career and most others who go this route. Also, they don't become subject matter experts themselves. I have read so much and debated so much and argued so much. I've taken virtually every course in Princeton University in all sorts of things, from history to political thought to religious studies. I've gone to Harvard. My foundation has sponsored things, and I've gone through all the dissertations that came out concerning India for a period of 10 years. I did that because we sponsored a whole lot of them. So this business of rolling up my sleeves and putting so much thought and energy like I used to do in my technology days, relearning or reinventing myself. I think few people who are philanthropists actually reinvent themselves in that sense. I have taken on the West in my corporate career. I used to have thousands of employees working for me. When I was an entrepreneur, then, I used to compete against them. So I have known Westerners, both Americans, British people, French people, German people. I have known them in close quarters. I have known them as my boss, as my subordinate, as my colleague. I've known them as my partner and collaborator, as my competitor. I've been deep into that kind of corporate culture and that ecosystem. And so I understand them. I know the opposing side. I do what is called Purva Paksha, which means you study your opponent. So I've done that very well. And therefore, I think there are a lot of differences between my journey and the typical guy who's learned all this stuff in the last few years, picked up all these buzzwords and goes around giving lectures and talks and says, oh, okay, I can do the same thing. I'm sorry, they just don't have that foundation, that grounding, which would give them the strength, also the psychological and emotional strength and the resilience to persist. I just don't think most people have that.
Right. Let's talk a little about your new book, or a lot about your new book, which is AI and the Future of Power, which really sets us, in the moment, in history right now. And it makes us understand where we're headed. Very few books tell us what we're up against. And I think the 5 battlegrounds that you've identified, I'll just read them out quickly for the benefit of our viewers. You've talked about the economy, industry, education, jobs. You've talked about geopolitics and military. You've talked about modernization of the masses, which is by far my favorite, which I hope we'll discuss in detail. You've talked about the loss of selfhood to artificial emotions and gratification, and the stress to the idea of the Indian Rashtra. Let's talk a little about modernization, which truly is my favorite. And I think it's a wonderful term, and it really sums up where we're at currently.
Great, wonderful. This is actually my favorite topic also. So regarding moronization, to me, what is well known about AI is that artificial intelligence is making machines smarter. But what is not well known and not well appreciated is that by the same token, people are becoming dumber. People are becoming more dependent on, Google. I call them Google Devta will tell us what we need to know. Siri will tell us. And Facebook said this, and so got more tweets. He must be right. So what's happened is that the traditional sources of authority are not important to this generation, young generation, and they've kind of outsourced their knowledge and the criteria of truth to these social media networks. The problems of social media, you got to understand the nature of algorithms, and these algorithms are not static; they're constantly learning, and that's what AI comes in. They are based on machine learning, and so the algorithms are driven by AI, and then this AI is driven by big data. big data is all your behavior. Every time you click something, the big data that is part of the big data profile of you, and the machine learning system figures out what you like, what you don't like. All that is updated, what your propensities are, what your vulnerabilities are, where they can make you buy something or not buy something. Ideologically, are you this kind, that kind? All of that profile is going on. 7-8 years ago, I was invited to Facebook headquarters to give a talk closed behind doors. At that time, Facebook was tracking on an average 6,000 parameters for every individual who's a member. It's not just 5 or 10 ways of describing because these computers are so powerful. So the computing power is so huge that these computers are becoming immensely smart, and people are becoming dumber. So I call that moronization of the masses, because the people have outsourced their agency in some ways, and people have started running their lives on autopilot. So the perfect moron for the marketing companies, for the big data companies, for the social media companies, the perfect moron is says, I'll let Netflix decide what movies I should watch. Yeah. I'll let some network decide who I should go dating, where I should go for vacation or holidays, what products I should buy. I mean, because these guys know me better. This business of moronization is a dream come true for digital marketing people, because they love people who won't think for themselves, who won't ask hard questions. It's a dream come true for digital politics, digital, ideological warfare, all sorts of ideologies coming, intruding into India, foreign ideologies, domestic ideologies, and all of them using this AI as a weapon. So this morons are a good target. And my book also says that Indian public is highly moronized. Indian public is highly moronized. They don't want to know all this, because they think that we are this Vishwa Guru, or we are this, protected by old. We are the legacy of the rishis. But today, people are not like the rishis. They are not learned people. They are tamasic people. Today's public is not a role model for what our heritage called for.
Right. One of the things that struck me when you were talking, Mr. Malhotra, is that why did the 20th century not prepare us? You are an exception, but why did the 20th century not prepare most of us for what the 21st century was going to unleash on us? Why is that?
No, this is a very interesting question. Actually, my generation is guilty. Yeah. My generation is guilty for leaving behind a very messy world to the next generation.
Right.
I feel sorry for the youth of today. I mean, my favorite target group is the young people. And I always tell them that, your elders have actually, in a sense, let you down, whether it's global warming, whether it's all these other problems going on, whether it is this AI thing. We have been greedy in terms of accumulating wealth and pursuing selfishly. We have defined ourselves in narrow identities here in the little identities, and we've tried to hustle, compete against everybody else. We've depleted the earth we've depleted Mother Nature. So, we produce a lot of problems. And so we've left a very messy world to the next generation. The responsible thing would have been that, in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, the world enjoyed so much growth and so much development, so much prosperity. But, the people who are the haves, the people who are the billionaire club, and the people who are in governments and all of that, they did not live up to the responsibility to really address these issues. But in the bigger scheme of things, people have fattened themselves with a tremendous amount of money and power, but they haven't been generous in giving back, and they haven't been generous in thinking of the long term. Short-term jugaad. Short-term jugaad mentality has brought us to where we are.
And yet we think that, we have such a wonderful past, and, we were the first to invent. I mean, you hear of this all the time. We were the first to invent the zero. We were the first in cosmetic surgery. We were the leaders. Why this obsession with living off a past? Why can we not face what we are in right now?
Yes, very important question. So, I'm disappointed with our people, because, I'll tell you, when people ask me, what do you think of the Vedic civilization, what is now the new name is the Hindu Dharma.
Right.
I differentiate between the ideal of that civilization, let's call that topic A, versus B, which is today's human beings, today's the Vedic dharma as an ideal is phenomenal, but today's people who are practicing it, who have that identity, are actually quite I'm quite disappointed with them. Not only they don't live up to that ideal, you look at the pollution, you look at the corruption, you look at the lack of hard work, you look at the all the mandates that are in the tradition, which are so great that you are supposed to live up to, and the importance of truthfulness and the importance of compassion, all of those things when you look up to versus what is the reality is quite lousy. I'm quite disappointed with the people who are members of my faith. And I believe in my faith, but I'm quite disappointed with the people, including the leaders, whether they are political leaders who are fighting in the name of Hinduism, or whether they are spiritual leaders, with some exceptions.
Yeah.
So I feel that such people are prone to become morons, because they are looking for the easy way out, and they're looking for, what will this Bada Saab in America think of me, and maybe I'll get a trip somewhere, maybe I'll get a pat on the back from this social media. So they have this inferiority complex. I mean, we can get into maybe it's a result of colonization or whatever the cause may be. The fact is, today we are deeply complexed. We have a lot of inferiority complexes. We are looking for pat on the back, a hug from some white guy, and so this is exactly the recipe to be morons. So the fact that the past was great doesn't mean that today we are great.
Yeah.
Let me tell you this: we were considered the software superpower until some years ago.
Right.
What happened to AI? How come that China is 10 years ahead of us in AI, which is computer science?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the epitome of computer science. The pinnacle of computer science now is artificial intelligence. So how come the country that has been proud that we are the software superpower has suddenly realized that, hey, we're 10 years behind? So because we became complacent, we took the easy road out of renting brains cheap, building intellectual property for Americans and Chinese and Europeans with our brains. The strange thing is, we are so far behind in the fundamental technology of AI. And yet when you go to all these big Western companies that are the leaders in this kind of a technology, you'll find a lot of Indian brains. But they're not working for India. They're not owners of intellectual property and the patents. Those belong to the owners, and the owners tend to be Westerners. Right. We tend to be employees. Whether it is Sundar Pichai, who may be worth hundreds of millions, he's an employee at the end of the day. Whether it is Satya Nadella, we may be very proud of him, and I'm proud that our people have gone and done well. But they've done well for themselves as an individual. It is not something for the country. So as far as the nation is concerned, exporting raw brains is not the same thing as exporting technology which belongs to us. So that's what's happened to us. And so where is the leadership? Who's accountable for this? Is it the industry people? Yes. Is it the political people? Yes. Is it the RSS type people who say that we are the keepers of Rashtra? Well, if you are the keepers of Rashtra, then you got to be thinking about all this. Yeah. How could you not have thought of artificial intelligence for the last 10 years when that is what's taking over the world? How come you are so naive and dumb and ignorant about all this? And so I think that we have to ask fundamental questions about our society right from the top to the bottom. And this is not a partisan view. I'm not for one party versus another party. I'm saying all parties and the whole political elite collectively needs to be cross-examined, and the Aam Aadmi needs to ask these hard questions about themselves and about their leaders.
Right. And, one of the things that I really like about your critique is that, in India, we tend to blame the state for everything. Oh, the government is doing this. Oh, it's because of the government. But you also bring in the corporates. And I think the corporates are really almost as culpable, aren't they, at the state at which we're in?
Yeah. And so, you look at research, percentage of research allocation in India is abysmal.
Yes.
India is either the technology industry is basically arbitraging on wages. I hire someone for 10,000, sell him for 40,000 or whatever. May I make my money? That's not technology. There's no R&D going on. Now, in China, just to draw a comparison, they also did labor arbitrage for manufacturing because they had cheap labor. So they went to the Americans and said, okay, we'll rent you our factory workers for a fraction of your factory workers. Why don't you put up factories here? So they also made a lot of money, but they took 50%, 25% to 50% of all the money they made from wage arbitrage, and they invested in futuristic technologies to achieving a large part of that. So China made huge bets because they were able to take the risk and say we're not looking for quick bucks that we'll go public, we'll do an IPO, go public, make a lot of money on the stock market, and become rich as the promoters. They were not looking at it short term. They had enough. They felt that okay, those of us who made enough money, we're fine, but we'll now make very long term bets to beat the Americans at their own game. We didn't do that. We kept on supplying, being below the glass ceiling, and supplying labor to the Americans. In China, Chinese government made the long-term bets, and brought the industry along. So the industry and the government worked hand in hand. In the United States, the Department of Defense, DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, they are the inventors of the last 50 years like nobody else. So India, we think our Vedanta tells us to be away from the short-term glory and short-term, desires, and think long-term. And that is how a Vishwa Guru is supposed to be. But the reality is not like that. We have not behaved like we are Vishwa Guru. We have not behaved the way our philosophy wants us to behave. So there's a big disconnect between the ideal, which is phenomenal, versus the actual, which is just not good.
And the other thing that I loved was, when you talk about the soft power and the hard power, and you talk about Ram and you talk about Krishna, and you say that eventually they both had to lean on hard power to, whether it was defeating Ravan or whether it was winning the war. And I love that. And, again, really bring that into this argument that, what is the point of being the Vishwa Guru in soft power if you don't have the hard power?
Yes, absolutely correct. You picked up tremendously important points from my book, and I'm so thankful to you because you're bringing these out, and few interviewers have brought these kind of things out. So, they say power flows through the barrel of a gun. I mean, that's the communist revolution. Exactly. And I would add to that, soft power flows through the barrel of a gun, which means soft power is based on hard power. It's something icing on the cake, but you got to have that foundation. If you don't have hard power, then what you have is culture. But they'll take it from you. I mean, yoga has become part of the American process. Right. Nobody who's doing yoga says that, I should support India in this Congress bill or this Senate bill. I shouldn't be attacking India because, they're giving me this yoga and I'm learning so much from it. Or this Ayurveda, I should be grateful. I cured my disease because of this. And so I better vote in their favor. Power is a different thing than culture. So the soft power requires, the prerequisite has to be that because of your culture, they voted in your favor, they exercised, they made policies in your favor, their positions on geopolitics and international affairs have tilted towards India because they've got yoga from you, for instance. But there's nobody in the US Senate or Congress or in the European Parliament who says the reason I'm voting for India, and the reason I'm going to vote against a bill that is criticizing India is because, they've given me this culture and I'm grateful to Mother India. Nobody, it has not transformed into power. And there is an art that the Ministry of External Affairs doesn't have, that all those who are the keepers of culture in our country, for our country, have not understood that it is not having song and dance and Bollywood and Indian food and all that and saying, okay, it is soft power. That's a good celebration of culture. But, the lessons from our itihas also tell you that, Lord Ram, Bhagwan himself, cannot convince Ravan using arguments and soft power to do the right things. He has to use hard power on him eventually. Okay. And similarly in the Mahabharata, Sri Krishna cannot convince Duryodhan. It's not that truth will triumph and you just be truthful and give a lecture and all that and the person believes. The reality of what we live in, the reality in the Ramayana, the reality in the Mahabharata, and the reality in today's Kurukshetra is that hard power is very important. Soft power will give you another edge on top of it. It is not that it is a substitute for hard power. Look at today's most successful diplomacy this year is India giving this COVID vaccines to various countries. It is not culture. At the end of the day, you've given them vaccines. It's good for their health. It's good for their economy. They're very grateful to you. And that is more clout, more diplomatic clout than all this cultural exchange that we keep talking about. I'm not against culture. I promoted it all my life. I've supported all this. But I feel that people started using it as an escape from responsibility to create hard power. So we haven't converted Indian culture into soft power effectively yet. And there's a lot of fanfare. There are all these soft power organizations and institutions, and they have all these meetings and celebrating and patting each other's back that we are this soft power, but the rest of the world doesn't recognize that.
I see that you obviously couldn't have won too many friends in the Indian establishment.
Well, I haven't won friends anywhere because I'm a true intellectual, and a true intellectual should do where the truth takes him. But I'll tell you one thing, just like you are appreciative, there is a very large number of people who are appreciative, extremely large number of people. And they tell me privately all the time. It's just that publicly, many of them are risk averse. They don't want to say this. They don't want to be associated with me because they think that I'm too open, So the thing is that I sought out this career, this new part of my life, to learn, to enrich myself, to be true to my dharma, to give back to society by raising the standard of understanding. And I'm achieving that, and I'm very satisfied, and it's made me a better person. I did not do it to get a career out of it in the sense of getting politically elected or getting some appointment somewhere or getting some award. I couldn't care less about those things. So I'm okay whether I'm in their good books or bad books. The sad thing is that people who have benefited a lot from these ideas try to block me because they would rather put their own selves as the author. That jealousy is there, that they want to block me. And so this lack of availability in the mainstream media, that is hurting me in the sense that people who are not the right people, the not qualified people, get to be ahead with the same ideas that actually they did not create. So that bothers me rather than whether it's irritating people or not. And India will realize, I'll tell you one thing, 10, 12 years ago, when I came out with my book, Breaking India, it was very controversial and people didn't accept it. And the publisher said, we cannot put this map of a broken India on the cover. It'll scare people. There are a lot of people. And it took me a lot of effort. It took me 1 year to at least get people taking the book seriously. I expect this is going to happen here also, that it will take me much of this year, and I'm determined to do all of 2021, educating people on this book. But you know what, since we started just several weeks ago, the book has been out less than 2 months. We have had such a huge ramp up and such a lot of traction, so many people coming, and they're waking up. First reaction is often disbelief. This must be conspiracy theory. It must be some far-fetched fantasy for the next 100 years, or something cynical to that effect. Or we've already heard this, there's nothing new. But then as more and more people begin to understand it, then people come back and say, yeah, I'm noticing Twitter did this, and this happened on that occasion, and this, I also experienced it. So they start noticing things through their own lens. They start noticing things and seeing how they fit into the framework that I've been talking about. So gradually, more and more people are coming. So I'm quite confident that as the weeks and months go by this year, this book will become established the way my previous books were. And I'm very convinced that for this decade, between now and 2030, a huge amount of works will be done, spin-offs from this book, offshoots from this book. A lot of people will start having these conversations, and this business of artificial intelligence and how it puts stress on the Indian Rashtra will become a very common topic. That's my prediction.
And let's talk about that, because you, in another conversation, I know, mentioned 2025 as a year where you see a lot of stress on the Indian Rashtra, a lot of almost a tremendous amount of stress on it. Could you explain that a little? Why did you say that?
So, when I did my book, Breaking India, I actually went undercover and looked at a lot of international organizations that are part of these Breaking India forces. Mm-hmm. And I went to their headquarters. I went as an author. I went as a journalist, as a human rights activist, whatever. And I got to know them. And sometimes they would not tell me, but I would send some other people. I had scholars working for me, interns. So I had done the same thing in the last 5 years in this area. And I must say that the use of artificial intelligence to manipulate human psychology, especially of morons, and to convert them to different ideologies, to make them fight each other, to make them angry at one another, figuring out who has what tendencies, what are the weaknesses, how to make them do this. This has become more of a science, and Indians have become so open, allowing their big data to be taken by anybody and used in any way, that all these experiments, all the big data that India is giving out, we are very proud that we have hundreds of millions of people on WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter and all that, as if that's a great glory to us. Actually, we are the biggest experiment in the world for managing thoughts, for learning, deep learning of human psychology. So we are well understood in terms of what are the algorithms that will be good for managing us.
Sorry to interrupt, but at one point you call us the biggest guinea pigs as well.
Yes, in this psychological thing. So this is happening not as a coincidence. I have knowledge I did not want to disclose in this particular book. Maybe I'll do it in my sequel, but I have a lot of this information. That this knowledge is not coincidental. There are people who are benefiting, who are planning, who are making strategies to intervene in India, in the political structure, in the social structure, communalism, violence, conflict. So I see what I call Breaking India 2.0, which is artificial intelligence enabled Breaking India. The Breaking India forces have now upgraded to BI 2.0, and our people don't know this, and they don't want to know this. They just want to feel good. When I talk about it, they say, "Sir, aapne to hamara feel good kharab kar diya hai." Let's talk about music and Bollywood and nice cricket dance and all that. So, but facing these issues is what Kshatriyata is all about, and we pride ourselves with the tradition of Kshatriyas, but we have to become that. So I feel that people who are afraid, psychologically and emotionally afraid to deal with these problems, becoming more and more morons, easily managed, big data in the hands of outsiders more than in the hands of insiders, and these tendencies which are vociferous tendencies of breakup and divisiveness within India being fed. I think this is going to get out of hand, and I feel that the external threats, China is not going to put its troops inside India. They'll just have them on the border and keep doing that. But Pakistan is available, and Pakistan is a Chinese colony, and so Pakistan love to do all the dirty work for them. China has the money, and China has the technology and the AI, facial recognition. Facial recognition is a very dangerous thing. Facial recognition, now there's not only recognizing this is Rajiv and this is X and this is Y, but also what mood they have. Are they happy? Are they sad? Whom they are hugging with love? Whom they have jealousy towards? This business of figuring out the emotions. It's all based on more and more testing, more and more experimentation, and the more data of yours that you are giving up, the more they are understanding you better, and they're understanding you better for their own purposes. So China has actually access to the largest database of human genome, genetics they're capturing all over the world, and facial recognition. So they can blackmail many of our people. Many of our people don't realize they're using all this Gmail and all these kind of things, and all this instant messaging and WhatsApp and whatever they're doing. They don't realize that they're actually being mapped. They're actually being plotted in terms of what's vulnerable about them, some scandals about them, some dirty stuff about them, blackmailing possibilities. So I feel that this is a very sophisticated level of warfare. It's a new kind of psychological warfare our people just don't know about. And I'll tell you, the only people who I've come across in India that seem to understand the problem are the military people.
Yeah, I was about to say, you've said that before.
Yes, because I feel that when I talk to them, they instantly pick up. They don't resist and pretend, no, this is not going to happen. They instantly pick up, and I feel they're worried. They're worried. So now there'll be some breakthroughs in technology like quantum computing and a few other things, which will take this business to another level. And we are not up to the mark. We are doing things now. Recently, in the last year or so, we started doing things, but it's too little and too late. So I feel that we have serious problems, and we still don't have an AI and related technologies initiative on the size of Atomic Energy Initiative and Space Initiative. We don't have that even now. It's a lot of talk, a lot of babus, a lot of planning people here and there, but it's not something very strong on a scale that India needs.
Right. In fact, you also talk about this whole idea that we've lulled ourselves with the idea of the demographic dividend, and you say there's no such thing.
I think it's a demographic nightmare
Yeah.
because youth have hands to work
Yeah.
and brains to work, but youth also have stomach to feed.
Exactly.
And so the stomach to feed is necessary
Yeah.
necessary because for survival, whether the guy is using his hands to work and brain to work or not. The point is, if your people are unemployed, it's going to be a nuisance. So right now, let's look at some facts. About 17 million, and it could be plus or minus 1 million depending on the source, but about 17 million youth every year reach the age at which they're looking for a job.
Right.
Whether it is 18, whether it's 20, whatever the age is that they need to now be working.
Right.
There is 17 million or so people, but only a fraction of that many new jobs are created.
Right.
So what happens to the rest? Well, some of them are just absorbed by the family. They work on, farms are already overpopulated because half the Indian people work on farms. You cannot afford to have so many people there. Some of them are absorbed there. Some of them, the government creates fake jobs, artificial jobs created just to keep people off the street.
Right.
That's not really productivity. That's just somebody being hired where you need 2 people, they'll have 5 or 6 standing there. And so, all this can go on so long. Now, what happens is that these surplus people are like a burden because you got to feed them, you got to give them medical facilities, educational facilities, subsidize this, that, and the other, get cooking gas. And I'm very glad the government is doing a good job of giving them homes rather than just ignoring them and neglecting them. But it's good that we give them dignity, but at a certain cost. The people who are productive are a fraction. And among those who are productive, also you can say a few people on a world scale productive, at the leading edge in the leaders, they're very, very few. And then the large majority are sort of doing busy work and low skill work, but they're gainfully employed. And then the huge number of people are just dependent.
Yeah.
So this is not sustainable. And India needs a very aggressive population policy. I mean, how to do it, I am not the expert. What should be the method of doing it? How do you coerce people or convince people or incentivize people? Maybe India needs to say that all these quotas and special programs available are only for the first child. One child in the family, we will give him the education and all these kind of privileges. Beyond that, you're on your own. Maybe Indian government has to say that. Because right now, you can have 10 children and the government has to look after all 10 of them. So something is not right. But, then democracy is a very difficult thing for India because democracy means that you got to be popular. You cannot take steps that will pay off 20 years from now like China did. You cannot tell people that for 20 years, we're going to make the sacrifices and then, the next generation will benefit. Nobody will vote for you. So you got to tell people what they like to hear. And so you keep fooling them into thinking we are this Vishwa Guru, we are doing very well. I'll give you this free, I'll give you that. It's popular. It's populism, and you'll get a lot of votes. So Indian politics has turned into symbolism, fighting dirty battles with each other, exposing each other's scandals and all that, and promising all kind of fake things. So, if you consider success of India as consolidation of political power, India is doing very well. But if you consider success as taking on the people ahead of us who are after our lives, which is China and Pakistan, we are not doing well. If you look at how are we doing vis-a-vis the Breaking India forces, we don't even know what they're up to because for 10, 12 years, I've been saying you got to monitor them. You got to have more people like me, give me some resources and I will expand what I'm doing. I can do some surveillance on them. I can be reversing the gaze and keeping track of them. But the interest has been more taking what I've produced and marketing it in their own name, making slogans out of it, becoming popular and passing resolutions, but no action. So
because what's happening now, Mr. Malhotra, is that we're really living from election to election, aren't we?
Yes.
And that's really the worst kind of democracy to be in a way.
Yes. So it's a stage where
and not even general election. We're living from state election to state election.
Yes. And the thing is, there's a whole election machinery, and the political class are all evaluated and given appointments based on, how good they are in getting votes, whether they are brainy or not, whether they're intelligent or not. and then the actual governance is left to the babus, and the babus are all old school. Then the babus don't understand this AI kind of stuff and the new technology kind of stuff. And so, if the political, so we are run by Neta, Babu, and Thekedar. That is the Neta is the political class, and they're not subject matter experts. The babus are the ones who control the machine, but they are not really, in terms of executive skills on a world-class basis and having knowledge at the cutting edge. They're not there. And then there is a Thekedar, which is, you can say, for all the private industry that want to get in and get contracts and get permission and get licenses and all that. They have to have offices in Delhi and schmooze all the babus and the netas. So Delhi is kind of an ecosystem. I'm a Delhi wala, but Delhi is kind of an ecosystem, a networking where everybody knows somebody else. Everybody I meet in Delhi says that through somebody else, Modi, and through somebody and somebody else, they know this one. So whoever you want to know, everybody name dropping that I can get you there, I can get you an appointment, I can get you a meeting, and then they want something for it because they introduce you to somebody who introduce you to somebody. It's a fraud system. I mean, this is not how a Vishwa Guru emerges. So I'm quite disappointed with all that. And this is too much party. And another thing is that Delhi is too powerful, and Delhi is alienated from India. I find this to be the case. I spent, except for the last year due to COVID, I didn't come, but I've been out of India for 50 years, and I have never failed to come 4 times a year. 4 times a year I come. So I'm very connected. And when I come to India, I spend no more than 20-25% of my time in Delhi and meet all the relatives and do all the hugging and party, and all my St. Stephen's friends can call me and we can have nice, all that stuff. Okay, we go to the golf club here and Gymkhana club there, do all that stuff. And they're good books. But rest of my time, I go to Tamil Nadu, I go to Bangalore, I go to,
That's where
Bombay.
stuff is happening.
I go all of that. So I'm actually very connected. And so I feel that the thinking in other places in India is very different from Delhi. So, that's also a problem. When they ask me to evaluate all these AI things that are coming out of India, it's people like McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, foreign guys who are marketing and getting their money out of big corporate people. So they're pro-corporate and they're trying to give the corporate spin. And it's people like Niti Aayog sitting in Delhi, and a few ministers sitting in Delhi. So it's people who are not connected with the grassroots. I mean, they're not really, I haven't seen a single AI report on India, which is based on a study of how it will affect migrant workers, what will be the effect on villages, on panchayats, on poor states. That is real India. And if the bottom 500, 600 million people are going to be devastated, that's going to destroy the country. And I have not seen that happen. It's all top-down studies and reports by whether it's economists, whether it is business people, whoever.
Before we let you go, you've said this before many times that AI now knows us better than ourselves. What can we do to beat the machine?
So, this is very, very good, because I'm glad, I don't want people to think I'm against AI. I'm a technocrat. I think that, first of all, it's inevitable and you should join the movement and control it rather than running away from it and being a victim of it. AI is a fantastic thing, and I'm writing some sequel books which will explain how AI can be brought in harmony with our heritage, our Vedic heritage, our metaphysics, and made humane and made to work for humanity, and not be an elitist exploitative potential tool. So the recipe I have is that we should be more in the development of AI, not only as a machine and as a technology, but also the ideological premises. You see, if you look at artificial intelligence, what is being made artificially is intelligence. Yeah. So you need to understand what is intelligence. You need to have a model of intelligence, and then you can make it artificially. Mm-hmm. So the model of intelligence they have is based on Western neuroscience and Western universalism. And this is a problem for me, because this kind of a thing is not the model of intelligence that we have in our Vedic system. So if we were to understand the notion of intelligence itself, which is very deep in Sankhya, there's a theory of cognition, there's a theory of perception, a theory of memory. not only will we be able to bring in something unusual and original in AI for the whole world, we'll also be able to make it in harmony with our own civilization. And I think AI has turned into a device to give a force multiplier to Western universalism, and this Western universalism in the hands of a few global elites are sitting at the top of the pyramid, and below them is this giant machine of AI, and we are at the bottom of it. So we've become a subject of AI. Objectified. We have become objectified by AI. That to me is the problem, not the AI itself.
Great. Rajiv Malhotra, thank you very much for joining us. It was a real pleasure listening to us, listening to you. I highly recommend the book to all our viewers and our readers. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this has been a very interesting, exciting, and invigorating interview. And I love to hear what your viewers have to say. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
We hope you really enjoyed that session. You can find the entire schedule of ThinkEdu 2021 on our website, eventexpress.com. You can watch the rest of the sessions on our YouTube channel, eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, and edxlive.com. You can also check out our Facebook and Twitter handles. Thank you for watching.